direction for all 50 cells. Under the media keyword block, two zones are defined. The saturated zone extends from the base of the model at 0 meters to 13 meters, while the unsaturated zone extends from 13 meters to the top of the column at 20 meters. The porosity in the saturated zone is 25%. The effective porosity in the unsaturated zone is 10%, which reflects some of the pore space being occupied by air as opposed to water. I'll note that this is just sort of an ad hoc assumption here. There are ways to actually calculate this number, of course, and we'll get into that in the next webinar. The specified head boundary condition is, in this example, just a dummy boundary condition at the base of the column. The chemistry initial conditions simply assign solutions 1 and 2 and equilibrium phases 1 and 2, as we discussed on the previous slide, to the respective locations within the model domain. Finally, the flux boundary condition keyword block is used to specify a flux of water entering at the top of the column. The negative sign is with respect to the upward pointing z-axis and therefore indicates downward flow of water. So after all that, here are some of the model results after more than one pore volume of water has passed through the system. Again, remember that all water-rock interactions are modeled as being in equilibrium all the time, as opposed to considering reaction kinetics, which would perhaps be a more realistic way of handling this problem. The non-copper-bearing mineral phases are shown on the left graph, and the copper ore-forming minerals are shown on the right. For both plots, elevation is shown on the vertical axis, and the mineral masses, which are expressed in moles per unit volume of rock, are shown on the horizontal axes. In the unsaturated zone, all of the pyrite and the chalcopyrite is gone, which makes perfect sense since the water chemistry in that part of the column is being held in equilibrium with atmospheric oxygen. We see instead the precipitation of ferric hydroxide, gypsum, and jarosite as weathering products. Some of the dissolved copper in the unsaturated zone from the oxidation and dissolution of chalcopyrite ends up remaining there in the form of malachite. In the underlying saturated zone, pyrite and chalcopyrite remain and maintain reducing conditions favorable for the formation of secondary sulfide minerals. Bornite, for example, starts to form an enrichment layer right at the water table, where downward percolating water from the unsaturated zone containing concentrations of copper encounters reducing conditions. Again, the key takeaway idea here is that the water-rock interactions that take place in both zones are not hardwired in the model setup by location. Rather, they are determined by the model. Recall once again that the only difference in the chemical initial conditions between the two zones is the presence or absence of a large reservoir of atmospheric oxygen at equilibrium. Finally, here are some additional results to consider if you alter the problem definition just a bit. Potassium feldspar is assumed to represent a portion of the host rock, modeled as an equilibrium phase along with all of the other minerals. It provides somewhat of a pH buffer in this model against the sulfuric acid formed from the sulfide oxidation. If you remove it from the model, you can see that the simulated pH in the unsaturated zone will drop, which is more reminiscent of acid mine drainage conditions. This would be the graph on the far left. The middle graph indicates the resultant significant increase in the concentration of dissolved copper, largely because malachite is no longer stable in the unsaturated zone when the pH buffer is removed. Once all of this additional copper encounters the water table and the associated reducing conditions, the amount of bornite precipitated in the enriched zone correspondingly increases in comparison to the baseline case, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit and move over to another set of slides. And this sort of represents an elaboration or expansion of the 1D model that we just talked about. So this is a side demonstration. Let's take a look at how our admittedly very simple-minded fast supergene copper ore simulation can be made a little more complex and interesting. So again, we're expanding to 2 dimensions with respect to sort of a vertical cross-sectional view, and we're adding in some heterogeneities to influence flow and provide a little more realism to the model for the unsaturated zone. A specified flux boundary still introduces water into the top of the domain at steady state. So for this problem, the steady state Richards equation for unsaturated flow was solved using an external model, not within FAST itself. The resulting effective hydraulic conductivity distribution, that is the saturated hydraulic conductivity multiplied by the water saturation dependent relative permeability and water content, are passed along to FAST in the form of external text files. And we'll talk about how to do this in a subsequent webinar. This modifies the solution of the steady state flow equation within FAST to mimic unsaturated flow. And again, we'll go through a procedure for doing this with Python a little later. The actual Richards equation solver for this example was written in the Julia scripting language, if anyone is interested, and there is a link to that script and the example output as we move along in the next few slides on my blog. And so a link is shown at the bottom of the page if you'd like to look into that a bit more. Let's touch on the groundwater flow regime first before we get to the geochemistry. And again, this is all just a demonstration of what you can do with FAST. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details here at the moment. To set this problem up, the flow domain was specified as extending across 25 meters in the vertical direction and 50 meters in the horizontal direction. A correlated random field was used to distribute hydraulic conductivity values in the 2D cross-section. These are color-coded here to show the log transformed hydraulic conductivity distributions. The units are in meters per day, with the bluish shades representing more permeable zones and the yellow to red colors representing low permeability matrix material. There is some anisotropy here in the vertical direction. This is intended to represent weathered fractured zones, if you will, or just look at them simply as areas of increased permeability. Plot shows the distribution of water saturation once boundary conditions are applied. These include a specified water flux along the top of the model and a fixed head boundary along the lower left portion of the model domain to set up a simulated water table. You can see some spatial variability in saturation up in the vadose zone, and this just reflects different unsaturated hydraulic properties of the porous medium. Again, these calculations are for steady state conditions, and they were performed externally with respect to FAST using a code. Here is where the link with FAST actually comes into play. You can define an effective hydraulic conductivity that relates the intrinsic saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is a property of the pore structure of the porous medium, with relative permeability, which can be thought of as being saturation dependent. You can see the distribution of this quantity in this figure as indicated by the warmer colors above the water table and the cooler colors below. By importing this field into FAST and imposing the same boundary conditions, FAST is essentially solving a steady state unsaturated flow problem. And as I've mentioned before, we'll explore this idea more in our next webinar. We'll see how to actually import a hydraulic conductivity field into FAST in that case. Here, we're doing this all in 2 dimensions. Okay, so here's a comparison between the hydraulic head distributions generated by the Richards equation solver. This is shown by the dashed lines, and FAST, which is shown by the solid lines. The 2 look like they are aligned quite well in this example. Here, the groundwater velocity vectors are compared, which takes into account not only the water volumetric fluxes, but also the porosity in the saturated zone and the water-filled porosity in the vadose zone. The latter can be imported into FAST as a porosity through an external file. You can see here that the 2 models align quite nicely, with downward percolation occurring through the vadose zone, followed by flow to the left in the saturated zone, with heterogeneities in hydraulic conductivity influencing both the direction and the magnitude of flow. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the mineralogy for this model. This pie graph shows the mass distribution of the different mineral phases